The harsh electronic buzz of the card reader sounded like a siren in the cramped silence of the bodega, causing Julian to flinch as if he had been physically slapped. Insufficient funds. The clerk grunted without looking up from his magazine, sliding the platinum card back across the scratched countertop with a dismissive flick of his wrist. Julian felt the blood drain from his face, leaving him lightheaded as he stared at the piece of plastic that had once commanded limits of $500,000, but was now nothing more than a useless rectangle. "I am sorry," Julian stammered, his voice cracking from days of disuse, clutching the cold can of soup he had been hoping to buy for dinner. He fumbled in the pockets of his trench coat, a designer garment that was now frayed at the cuffs and stained with the grime of the city, searching desperately for loose change that he knew wasn't there. "Hust levit," the clerk sighed, waving a hand toward the door. Walking out into the biting November wind of Manhattan, Julian felt the cold seep through his thin clothes, a physical reminder of how far the mighty Julian Thorne had fallen from the penthouse suites and private jets that defined his life only 6 months ago. His stomach growled, a deep and painful protest that forced him to stop in front of a brightly lit diner called the Golden Spoon, a franchise he used to scoff at when he was dining at Michelin-starred restaurants. Through the fogged glass, he saw warmth and people eating, and the primal urge for food overrode his lingering pride. He pushed the door open, the bell chiming cheerfully, and the aroma of brewing coffee and frying bacon hit him with such intensity that he nearly swayed on his feet. He found a booth in the far back corner, hoping to disappear into the red vinyl upholstery so that no former colleagues or investors would spot the disgraced CEO of Thorne Logistics hiding in a 24-hour diner. A young woman in a pale blue uniform approached his table, holding a coffee pot with a practiced grace that suggested she had walked these floors 1,000 times.
"Hi there,"
she said softly, her voice carrying a warmth that seemed out of place in the sterile, fluorescent-lit room. "I am Mia, and I will be taking care of you tonight." Julian refused to make eye contact, staring intently at the laminated menu to hide the moisture gathering in his eyes, terrified that looking at her would break the dam of emotions he had been holding back for weeks. "Just coffee, please," he whispered, calculating in his head that he had exactly $3 in quarters in his coat pocket, which would barely cover the drink and a meager tip. Mia didn't rush away or sigh with annoyance at the cheap order, but instead, she lingered for a second, her gaze sweeping over his trembling hands and the dark circles under his eyes. "Coming right up," she said gently, placing a napkin on the table with a deliberate slowness. Minutes later, she returned not just with the coffee, but with a plate of hot, buttered toast and scrambled eggs, setting it down before him without a word. "I didn't order this," Julian said quickly, panic rising in his chest because he knew he couldn't pay for the meal. "I know," Mia replied, pouring the steaming coffee into his mug until it reached the brim. "But the cook made a mistake and doubled the order for table 4, so instead of throwing it out, I figured you might help us reduce our waste." Julian looked up at her then, really seeing her for the first time, noticing the way her eyes crinkled at the corners, and the strange sense of authority she held, despite the apron tied around her waist. He wanted to refuse out of pride, to tell her he didn't need charity, but the smell of the eggs broke his resolve, and he nodded silently, picking up the fork with a shaking hand. "Thank you," he choked out, the first bite tasting better than any caviar or Wagyu beef he had ever consumed in his former life. Mia smiled, a genuine expression that lit up her face, and walked back to the counter to check the register, her movements sharp and efficient as she scanned the room. As Julian ate, he watched her work, noticing how she managed the flow of the diner with the precision of a logistics manager, directing the busboys and other waitresses with subtle nods and hand gestures that went unnoticed by the other customers. He had no idea that the woman refilling his coffee cup wasn't just working for tips, but was actually assessing the operational efficiency of one of the 300 locations she had inherited and quietly managed under a holding company. For the next hour, Julian sat in that booth, the warmth of the food and the diner thawing the ice in his bones, and for the first time since the bankruptcy court seized his assets, he felt a flicker of hope that perhaps he could survive the winter. When he finally stood up to leave, placing his stack of quarters on the table, Mia was there again, wiping down the adjacent booth. "See you tomorrow, Julian?" she asked, not as a question, but as an invitation. "Maybe," he replied, pulling his collar up against the threat of the cold outside, realizing that he had nowhere else to go and no one else who knew his name without attaching the word failure to it. He stepped back out into the New York night, the wind feeling slightly less bitter than before, unaware that the waitress watching him leave could buy his old company with a signature, yet she had chosen to give him toast instead of a check. The notification on the screen blinked into existence with a cheerful ping that belied the devastating news contained within the bold text. "We regret to inform you that we have decided to move forward with other candidates," Julian read under his breath, the words blurring together as fatigue stung his eyes. He slumped back in the hard plastic chair of the public library, the only place in the city that offered warmth and internet access for free, and rubbed his temples where a headache had been throbbing since dawn. This was the 50th rejection in 2 weeks, a statistic that seemed impossible for a man who had once graced the cover of Forbes magazine as a logistical visionary. Shutting down the computer, Julian gathered his few belongings, pulling his coat tighter around himself as he prepared to face the biting wind that whipped through the avenues of Manhattan. His feet, now accustomed to the rhythm of defeat, carried him instinctively toward the Golden Spoon, the neon sign acting as a lighthouse in the turbulent sea of his existence. As he pushed through the door, the familiar bell announced his arrival. But this time, Mia didn't greet him with her usual smile because she was buried under a mountain of paperwork spread across the counter. Julian approached, slowly noticing the furrow in her brow and the way she chewed on the end of her pen. A habit he had learned meant she was trying to solve a puzzle that didn't have an obvious answer. "Trouble in paradise?" he asked quietly, sliding onto his usual stool at the end of the counter. Mia looked up, startled, and quickly tried to organize the papers. "But?" Julian's sharp eyes had already caught the header on the top sheet, which detailed supply chain routing for the Northeast sector. "It is a mess," Mia admitted, exhaling a long breath and pushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear. "The distribution trucks are consistently late to 3 of our locations in Queens, and the regional manager cannot figure out why the costs are skyrocketing." Julian looked at the map she had sketched out on a napkin, his brain instantly shifting gears from survival mode to the analytical precision that had built his empire. "May I?" he asked, reaching for the pen without waiting for an answer, his hands steady for the first time all day. Mia watched in silence as he drew 3 sharp lines across the map, circling 2 intersections and crossing out the current route the trucks were taking. "They are getting stuck in the Midtown tunnel traffic because the schedule has them leaving the depot at 6 instead of 5, Julian explained, his voice gaining strength and authority. "If you shift the departure time back by 45 minutes and route them through the lower bridge, you save 20% on fuel and avoid the gridlock entirely." He tapped the paper with the pen, a spark of his old confidence returning to his eyes, momentarily forgetting that he was a man who couldn't afford a sandwich. Mia stared at the modifications he had made, realizing that in 30 seconds, this homeless man had solved a logistical nightmare that had baffled her corporate team for a month. "You are brilliant," she whispered, looking at him with an intensity that made Julian flush with embarrassment. "I used to be," he corrected, the light in his eyes dying out as the reality of his situation crashed back down on him. "Now I'm just a guy who knows which bridges have the least wind when you have to sleep under them." He tried to hand the pen back, but Mia closed her hand over his, her skin warm and soft against his rough, cold nuke. "You are not just a guy, Julian," she said firmly, ignoring the customers who were waving for their checks. "Everyone falls, but it takes a special kind of mind to see solutions when everyone else only sees problems." Julian pulled his hand away gently, unable to handle the kindness because he felt he didn't deserve it after losing his investors, money, and his family's trust. "I lost everything, Mia," he confessed, his voice dropping to a rasp as he stared into his empty coffee mug. "I tried to expand too fast. I ignored the risks, and I dragged good people down with me. So please do not look at me like I am a genius because I am the architect of my own ruin." Mia didn't offer platitudes or tell him it would be okay, which Julian appreciated more than he could say. Instead, she reached under the counter and pulled out a slice of blueberry pie, placing it in front of him with a solemn nod. "The architect of your own ruin is also the only one who can design the reconstruction," she said, turning back to the register as the cook rang the bell for an order up. "Eat the pie, Julia. It is on the house." As Julian took a bite of the sweet, warm pastry, he watched Mia navigate the diner, unaware that she was already texting the solution he had provided to her chief of operations, crediting an anonymous consultant. He felt a strange sensation in his chest, something he hadn't felt since the gavel came down in bankruptcy court, a feeling that perhaps he wasn't entirely obsolete in this world. But outside, the snow had started to fall, heavy and wet, a silent warning that the night was going to be the coldest of the year. And Julian knew that no amount of pie could protect him from the reality waiting beyond the glass doors. The bitter cold of the New York winter did not arrive with a polite knock, but rather kicked the door down, transforming the city into a frozen landscape that showed no mercy to those without a key to a warm room. Julian huddled deeper into the recess of the service entrance where he had spent the last 2 nights, his body racked by a coughing fit that felt like broken glass rattling inside his chest. He had not been to the Golden Spoon in 3 days because the shame of his deteriorating condition outweighed his hunger, and he refused to let Mia see him looking like a specter of the man he used to be. A fever burned behind his eyes, distorting the world into a hazy smear of gray concrete and white snow, making it difficult to distinguish between the hallucination of warmth and the reality of the ice seeping through his boots. Mobeita Longpal, a security guard barked, rapping his baton against the metal door frame, the sound exploding in Julian's sensitive ears like a grenade. "You cannot stay here," the guard added, his voice muffled by a thick scarf, showing a sliver of pity but bound by the orders of the building management. Julian tried to stand, but his legs felt like lead weights, and he had to use the brick wall to leverage himself up, his breath coming in shallow, painful gasps. "I am going," he wheezed, stumbling out onto the sidewalk where the wind immediately whipped his coat open, stealing the meager body heat he had managed to conserve. He walked without destination, his boots crunching on the salted pavement, driven by a subconscious homing beacon that pulled him toward the only place where he had felt human in the last 6 months. Through the frost-covered window of the Golden Spoon, he saw her. Mia was balancing a tray of milkshakes, her laughter visible even though he couldn't hear it. And for a moment, Julian just stood there, mesmerized by the life occurring on the other side of the glass. He knew he shouldn't go in, knowing that his presence would disturb the customers and likely get Mia in trouble with her boss. But the black spots dancing in his vision gave him no choice. He pushed the door open, the bells sounding distant and warped, and the blast of warm air that hit him caused his knees to buckle instantly. The diner went silent as the patrons turned to look at the disheveled figure dripping melting snow onto the linoleum floor, their expressions shifting from curiosity to disgust. "Hey, you can not be in here," a man in a business suit shouted from a booth, standing up to block Julian's path. Julian tried to apologize, to explain that he just needed water, but his throat seized up, and the room spun violently to the left. "Mia," he gasped, the name tearing from his throat as the darkness finally overtook him, and he pitched forward, hitting the floor with a sickening thud. The crash of the tray shattering was the only sound that broke the stunned silence of the diner. Mia was at his side in a second, her knees hitting the hard floor as she turned him over, her hands flying to his neck to check for a pulse. "Call 911, she screamed, her voice losing all its gentle waitress cadence and taking on the sharp, commanding tone of a woman used to being obeyed instantly. "Don't touch him, miss. He is filthy," the businessman sneered, stepping back to avoid the puddle of dirty water forming around Julian's coat. Mia looked up at the man, her eyes blazing with a ferocity that made him recoil, and for a split second, the mask of the humble server slipped completely. "Get back or I will have you removed from this building before you can blink," she snapped, the authority in her voice silencing the entire room. She pulled Julian's head onto her lap, disregarding the grime staining her apron, and brushed the wet hair from his burning forehead. "Julian, stay with me," she whispered urgently, pressing her hand against his cheek, which was terrifyingly hot. "You are not checking out on me yet. Do you hear me?" As the distant wail of sirens began to pierce the snowy night, Mia held the fallen CEO in her arms, her mind racing not with drink orders, but with the realization that the game of hiding in plain sight was over. She looked at his pale, gaunt face and made a decision that would unravel the secret she had kept for 2 years. "Prepare the car," she said into the sleek smartwatch she had pulled from her pocket, speaking to a person the diner patrons couldn't see. "We're not going to the public hospital. We're going to the private wing at Sinai and have the legal team meet us there." The customers watched in bewildered silence as the waitress they thought they knew began issuing orders that cost millions of dollars, while the man on the floor took a shallow, rattling breath, unaware that his rescue had just begun. Julian woke, not to the harsh glare of fluorescent lights or the shouting of a crowded emergency room, but to a silence so profound it felt heavy against his ears. He blinked, his eyes adjusting to the soft ambient lighting, and his fingers instinctively clutched the sheets, realizing with a jolt that they were high-thread-count Egyptian cotton, not the scratchy polyester of a public ward. Panic flared in his chest, a sudden spike of adrenaline that made the heart monitor beside him beep a lazy warning, because he knew with absolute certainty that he could not afford the air in this room, let alone the medical care. He tried to sit up, but a firm hand gently pushed him back down, a touch that was familiar yet commanded a new kind of respect. "Easy, Julian," a voice said, smooth and confident. "You have been out for 2 days with severe pneumonia and malnutrition, so do not try to run a marathon just yet." Julian turned his head, expecting to see Mia in her pale blue waitress uniform, but the words died in his throat as his brain struggled to process the woman standing by the window. It was Mia, but the apron and the messy bun were gone, replaced by a tailored suit that cost more than his former car, and a posture that screamed boardroom, executive rather than diner server. "Mia," Julian croaked, his voice rough but stronger than before. "I don't understand. Where am I?" Mia turned, her face softening into that familiar smile, though her eyes held a stilliness he hadn't noticed while she was pouring coffee. "You are at the private recovery wing of Mount Sinai," she explained, walking over to the bedside and pouring him a glass of water from a crystal pitcher. "And before you ask, the bill has been taken care of." Julian took the glass, his hands shaking slightly, looking at her as if she were a stranger who had worn a mask for months. "You are not just a waitress, are you?" he asked, the realization dawning on him like the slow rise of the sun. Mia pulled a leather chair close to the bed and sat down, crossing her legs with an elegance that belonged on a magazine cover. "My grandfather founded the Golden Spoon 50 years ago," she began, her voice steady. "When I inherited the holding company last year, I didn't want to rule from a glass tower without knowing what the ground floor felt like, so I put on the uniform to see where the cracks were in the foundation." She tapped her manicured fingernails on the side of the bed rail, looking deep into Julian's confused eyes. "I found plenty of cracks, Julian, but I also found something I didn't expect to find." Julian looked down at his hands, the shame returning in a hot wave because he realized she had seen him at his absolute lowest, begging for soup and shivering in doorways. "You've found a charity case," he muttered bitterly. "No," Mia corrected him sharply, leaning forward. "I found a logistical genius who, while starving and homeless, solved a distribution crisis on a napkin that saved my company $2 million this quarter alone." She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a thick document bound in blue leather, placing it on the blanket over Julian's legs. "What is this?" he asked, afraid to touch it. "It is the deed to Thorne Logistics, along with a receipt for your outstanding debts," she said casually, as if she were discussing the weather. "I bought your company's assets from the bank this morning, Julian." The room spun again, but this time it wasn't from fever. It was from the sheer magnitude of what she was saying. "Why?" he whispered, the tears finally spilling over, hot tracks running down his clean-shaven cheeks. "Why would you do that for me?" Mia stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the sprawling metropolis covered in pristine white snow. "Because you treated me with respect when you thought I was a nobody," she said softly, turning back to face him. "And because I need a chief operating officer who understands that the numbers on a spreadsheet represent real people, real families, and real struggles." She pointed to the document on his lap. "I do not want your gratitude, Julian. I want your brain. The company is yours to run again, but this time under my umbrella, and we are going to fix the supply chains in the Bronx first, because I am tired of the trucks being late." Julian placed his hand on the leather folder, feeling the texture of the binding, a tangible anchor to a future he thought he had lost forever. He looked up at the woman who had served him toast when he had nothing and given him an empire when he had less. "I can have the new route mapping done by Monday," he said, a smile breaking through the tears. The first genuine smile he had worn in a year. Mia grinned, the waitress and the CEO merging into one perfect savior. "I was hoping you would say that," she replied, checking her watch. "Now rest, because Monday is going to be a very busy day for us." As she walked out of the room, leaving the door slightly ajar, Julian looked out at the New York skyline, the buildings no longer looming over him like tombstones, but standing tall as monuments to the second chance he had just been given.